In the dim ages of the world's past, the land that was to become Rockhome lay under thick ice. It was not devoid of life, for monsters and creatures suited to icy existence lived and bred beneath the frosty crust, but it was inhospitable to human and demi-human inhabitants. The immortal known as Kag'yar, celebrated in different parts of the world as Kag'yar the Artisan and Flash Eyes Kag'yar, saw this dim landscape as nothing but an unpainted canvas. He whipped the curtain of ice from it and began to alter it to his liking. To begin, he created a creature which would be master of this land and celebrant of Kag'yar's philosophies. From a boulder, with his magics and consummate artistry, he fashioned a powerful mortal being, short of stature, strong of thew, clever of mind, long of patience. He called this being Rockborn, in the Dwarven language, Denwarf. Denwarf was the first of the Dwarves and their first king as well. In the first few centuries of the Rockhome Dwarven tribe, Denwarf guided them on a plan of controlled increase in the tribe's size, careful exploration of the mountains around them, cautious construction of settlements and mining enterprises throughout their lands. As the Dwarves spread out through the mountain region and began settling more or less independent communities, Denwarf made sure that he, and only he, could confirm each settlement's leader in his position, and that each settlement sent a representative to stay at Denwarf's court. In so doing, he set the precedents for Rockhome's modern system of appointed governorship and for the modern Dwarven Senate, or Grand Council. The individual communities grew from small families to large families to great multifamily villages and cities. At the end of 4 centuries, the Dwarven population had grown from the 500 or so Kag'yar had placed here to a substantial base of 125,000 dwarves. There were citadels at every known pass into the Dwarven mountains, and Denwarf, in his ongoing explorations, had discovered a vast cavern system deep beneath Point Everest and its surrounding hills, a cavern suitable to be the capital of the Dwarven race. Denwarf's programming told him it was time to leave the race to its own devices. However, deep within, the part of him that was capable of independent thought and emotion resented the fact that he must now surrender his throne and leave his charges. Nevertheless, he named the great cavern Dengar Rockhome and told his followers to build their great capital there. Then he nominated his heir, a worthy dwarf of the Everest family, giving his companions the ominous prediction that someday he would return to lead his people when they most needed him. He left his kingdom for the dark places below Dengar. The early Everest kings greatly slowed the growth rate of the Dwarven population. They intuitively understood the hazards of having their populations swell unchecked. They continued the tradition of exploration, defense, mining, and craftsmanship which Denwarf had promoted for so long. Some 400 years after Denwarf's disappearance, in the reign of the 10th king after Denwarf, the continent saw one of its periodic movements of non-human and demi-human tribes. This is a sort of domino effect. A strong tribe finds its ancestral lands are no longer able to support the tribe. The tribe moves and takes the more fertile lands of another tribe, which itself moves and squeezes out other tribes. In this case, the net effect was that hordes of hungry and desperate orcs and goblins began to move into the lands around Rockhome and eventually into the Dwarven mountains. It was obvious to these non-humans, because of the health and wealth which their Dwarven opponents possessed, that the lands within the mountain ring must be fertile. All they had to do was slay or drive off the dwarves, and they would once again have a homeland. Naturally, the dwarves weren't at all amenable to the idea, and so began a period of several centuries of warfare. Each spring, orcs and goblins would try to force themselves in through the Sardal Pass or over mountains, which had no convenient access to the Rockhome interior. The dwarves fought to protect their homeland. Fortifications were overrun, then recaptured and rebuilt. Above-ground dwarf villages were burned. the Dwarves sent punitive expeditions out into non-human territory to return the favor. During this time, the Dwarves and the Orcs developed a deep, fierce hatred for one another. Though the Goblins and Dwarves were enemies, they were merely fighting one another for survival. But the Orcs and Dwarves discovered real hatred for one another in this centuries-long conflict. Finally, however, in 492 BC, the greatest Orc army was broken and scattered to the winds in the famous Battle of Sardol Pass. From that time on, future Orc attacks were weak and ineffective. The Dwarven frontiers were more or less safe. After that time, years were measured as so-and-so many years since Sardol, and so the Battle of Sardol Pass became year zero in the Dwarven calendar. Slowly and cautiously, Rockhome colonists were sent out into the surrounding lands, generally with the permission or approval of friendly lands, to settle in mountainous areas elsewhere in the continent, sometimes to settle among humans as fighting families or engineering clans. In general, they were welcomed. Polite, though usually distant, hard-working and neat, the Dwarves were exemplary members of the communities they entered. Mostly, though, Rockhome history has been a smooth and steady chronicle of mining, exploration, colonization, occasional wars with orcs and other non-humans, frequent spats and clashes with the elven clans with whom they have so little in common, and gradual strengthening of the Dwarves' economic and military power. One bizarre low point in Rockhome's history of diplomacy with the humans nations occurred about 200 years ago, starting in AC 802. Word reached the Dwarves that there were rich deposits of gold to be found in the mountains of the nation of Glantry, northwest of Rockhome. The dwarf king of the time, Sturclint II of the Circlists, permitted bands of over-eager miners to depart Rockhome for Glantry without so much as a letter of intent to the Glantrians, hardly surprising, as the Glantrians were then in the throes of civil war and there was no central government. Unfortunately for the Dwarves, they arrived in Glantry at about the same time as a devastating plague. The Dwarves were suspected of bringing the disease, and Glantrians began to hunt them down to capture or kill them. Just as unfortunately, these Glantrian mages discovered that some of the Dwarves were strongly resistant to magic. This intrigued the mages, and long after the plague and the hatred resulting from it were gone, the mages captured Dwarves to subject them to study, including torture, murder, and autopsy. After a quarter century, all the Dwarves who had entered Glantry had been run off or captured, and the bitterness and hatred the Dwarves felt for the Glantrians have never diminished. Since then, the Dwarves of Rockhome have bided their time and waited for a chance to achieve revenge against the Glantrians. Certain old Dwarves who participated in those events are still alive and keeping the old hatreds alive. The years of infamy in Glantry, though not technically a war with that country, was the last significant clash that Rockhome has had with a civilized nation. Today, the Yilari are allies of the Dwarves, as are the Darrokin humans, who also try to mediate in disputes between Rockhome and the elven nation of Alfheim, which is near enough for eager dwarven adventurers to make occasional raids into. Rockhome mercenaries sometimes help in Ethengar border actions against Glantry, but there still have been no major wars in the last few centuries.
I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, and tell me what you think about the Dwarves of Rockhome in the comments below. Bye for now.